the temple courts. Okay, so Jesus is not, on a hillside. He's not in someone's house. He is in the temple courts, and he's teaching. And so all the people are sitting, and they're gathered around, and Jesus is teaching in the temple courts. And this is the setting for all of these events. And in the middle of this, in come the Pharisees with this woman and this question. So, just imagine if, like, right now, someone came in the middle of our class and said, look, we've got this person caught in the middle of sin. What do you say we do to him, right? This is the kind of scene that we have. Right in the middle of teaching, right in the middle of being in the temple courts, the Pharisees bring this woman in, right in the middle of Jesus' class. And so they have this woman, and she's caught in the act, right? Caught in the act, caught red-handed. So there's no doubt here about guilt. And they talk about what the law says. Now, it is not specifically mentioned here, but my assumption is they're referencing Leviticus chapter 20, and in verse 10, where it talks about, well, if a man commits adultery, then both must be put to death. Okay? That's what I assume the reference here when they say Moses says. So they bring this woman in, and they say, this is what the law said. Now, what the law actually says, if a man commits adultery, both must be put to death. What do we actually have here? Right? They brought the woman, right? It's a little bit off of what Moses said, because Moses said we must stone her, right? But actually in Leviticus chapter 20, what does it say? We're supposed to stone both of them. But they've only brought the woman here. Does anybody, do we think there's any motivation here behind why is there only one party?
May not have been a woman.
Yeah.
What was that?
They didn't think
it through.
Obviously.
Right. Personally, I think it's somewhat about power, right? The woman has no power. I'm gonna go way out on a limb on speculation, but the man may have been related to somebody who was of some importance, or maybe he was the son of Joe, and we don't want to do anything to offend Joe, and so. But the woman doesn't have any power, and she's brought before these people. I think that reflects a little bit the hearts of the Pharisees. Because I don't think the Pharisees in this story are the type of people who are really caring about what God's law is and are really caring about God's people. Because just in the act of bringing the woman here before Jesus, we see that there's a power vacuum. They're bringing the least powerful person and accusing them of the crime. And they're not really motivated because they love God's law. And we see here in verse 6 that really deep down all they want to do is stick it to Jesus, right? This woman's just a pawn in their power struggle. I think that's important to just kind of see what kinds of motivation the Pharisees have in this story. There's no purity here. There's no love of God. There's really no love of the law of Moses. There's certainly no love for people. But in their minds, this woman is really just a pawn, a weak person, insignificant, and they bring her in front of Jesus here. So, for a moment, when we look at the parties involved in this story. We've got these Pharisees. And they bring this woman who, I don't even think they see her as a person. She's not a person to them. She's just a pawn. And she's a sinner. And in their minds, she's just someone who needs to be judged. And so they bring her here before Jesus. In the hearts of the Pharisees, there's really no desire for forgiveness. There's really no intent to care about the life of this woman or the impacts of sin in the life of this woman or anyone else. She's just a person to be judged and to be taken care of. So now, I want to step back a minute. Because as we look, one of the things I want to do is look at the different characters in this story. The first group here is the Pharisees. And as we kind of look at their actions and their attitudes, I want to step back a minute and say, okay, let's bring it into today's world. How are we sometimes like the Pharisees in this story? Sometimes in life, do we just see people as bad, as sinners, as people who need to be judged? Sure. I mean, does that happen to us?
Far more often than we want to admit.
Right. Right. I think there's a bit of a cautionary tale here in this story, is because sometimes, like the Pharisees, we can be very knowledgeable in religion, we can be very knowledgeable in the Bible, but we're very slow to forgive. Because we see people and we say, man, they're sinners. They're doing wrong. They're liars, they're cheats, they're drunks, whatever. And instead of having a heart for forgiveness or love or concern, like the Pharisees, we have a heart that says, judgment is coming, right? And there's this danger that, like the Pharisees, we can be the ones who want to bring the punishment of God, not the message of God. See, and that's one of the things. The Pharisees, they've got the law of Moses on their side. I mean, they're right, aren't they? That's what the law says. So they've got the law on their side. But there's a danger that when the law is on their side, they don't really have a heart for the people in the story. They don't really care. And I think that is part of I think that's part of the message here as we go further through the story, is Jesus is going to challenge them on where their hearts really lie, as opposed to their knowledge of the law. Because they're technically correct, but they have no room for forgiveness. They have no room for love. So let's go to another player here. There's another player here that's I'm going to call the silent player. The crowd, right? Jesus is in the temple courts, and it says all the people came and Jesus is teaching, and so all the people are in the temple courts. So there's a crowd here, right? So it's not just Jesus and the Pharisees and the woman, but there's a crowd. And they've all come to Jesus, and this crowd is here with Jesus, and so they're watching the proceedings. They see the Pharisees come in, they see the woman come in. My guess is probably some of them knew the woman. You know, it's like, oh, isn't that the lady that lives next door to Bob? You know, it's like, this is probably probably not a situation where no one knows who this is. And they're sitting there and they're watching what's happening. And it's interesting, what does the crowd think? Well, I don't know because none of them say anything in the story.
I think if you look at the context that you're in, the crowd has started to believe this might be the Son of God. You look back in the previous chapters, he started his miracles, his teaching is far beyond what most people would know and is actually rivaling what they would think of as the scholars of the day. And I think part of what's happening is the Pharisees are afraid of him because of the kind of answer he's given here, and he'll continue to give throughout his ministry, that he understands exactly what Gary said. He understands the spirit of the law. And so he turns it back on. So if you think about it, he refers to them in other places as the den of vipers. He knows their sin. They know their sin too. So for him to turn it around on them and go, if you're without sin, go wrong. If you think about it, they would have known they were without sin. And that's why he called them the den of vipers.
Right.
So good trend.
Exactly. And see, that goes the exact setup here, right? Because the Pharisees see that the crowd is believing in Jesus and believing what he has to say, right? Because that's why they're bringing this challenge in front of Jesus in the first place. They're afraid of Jesus. So they got to do something to try and challenge his position. The crowd is there. They're wanting to believe at some level, right? Because they're there to listen to Jesus. And now they've become these onlookers to this scene, and now they're going to see how this plays out, because now they've got this power struggle in front of them, right? They've got this Jesus guy who goes around teaching on the one side, and then they've got the Pharisees, who they know as their religious leaders, their religious power guys. And now here they are facing off. But I want to say this about the crowd. Do you think the crowd wants to see a judgment here, or they want to see? What do you think they want to see here?
They want to see the same thing we want to see when we turn on the TV. They want to see drama.
Okay. Right. Nobody from nobody from the crowd jumps up and says, "Wait a minute, this isn't the time and place for this." Right? No, nobody from the crowd gets up and says anything to stop anything. Nobody gets up to defend the woman. Nobody in the crowd really does anything. They're all just there to see what's going to play out, and I'm going to guess that there's quite a few of them that are probably there going, "Hey, we're going to see somebody who's stoned." Right? Look at this. What's going to happen next? We're going to see something dramatic. Maybe we're going to see a judgment. Maybe we're going to see someone stoned. Right? But we have the crowd. Now I'm going to ask this question. How are there times where we're like the crowd? Maybe we don't want to get involved. Or maybe we just want to watch and see what's going to happen. We don't really, the crowd, again, I'm speculating, I understand that. But I don't think the crowd really had a great love for the woman. I don't think the crowd came there looking for a story of redemption for damaged lives, right? I think in this instance, they're sitting back and they're watching. What's going to happen? Am I going to see a stoning today? I don't think they had hearts full of godly love at this point. They're here, they're seeing what's going on. I don't think they necessarily wanted to see anyone forgiven. And I think, like a lot of people, they just didn't want to get involved, honestly. They just wanted to sit back and watch. What are we going to see today? What's going to happen?
should. So, I mean, it's a great question. Thought goes to my mind is that they could have been intimidated by the fact that the religious leaders were there. And not willing to speak up their minds, that would be in contradiction with what Pharisees, those leaders were doing. I think we can get in trouble today with that. We can go along with what our leaders say and not question, and at least, say, hey, maybe it's this way. And of course, go back to what we talked about at service today, is going back to the authority of the Word of God, and standing up for that in the face of what the current leaders, they say, is incorrect. Does that make sense? I mean,
No, I think that's a great point, because we see other places in the New Testament, particularly like the parents of the son who was blind that was healed, they didn't want to talk to the Pharisees because they were afraid the Pharisees might throw us out of the synagogue, right? So the idea that people might be intimidated by the fact that the Pharisees are in their midst, right? I mean, that's a great point, because part of the reason they could be staying silent is, what if I say the wrong thing and the Pharisees get mad at me, right? And again, that can be like us. Do we get intimidated by people where we're afraid to stand up for what God says because these people might criticize me or say something bad about me? Mr. Bernards?
At this point, I don't know what I don't know, and I'm going to go back here. They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. The crowd did not know that, or did they know that? So by them not saying anything or participating in this, they didn't know what the Pharisees had in mind. So a lot of times we are just stand buyers. We have no clue what's the objective of what's happening. But I think in cases like this, if we're in that situation, sometimes we need to stand up and say, guys, this is what's thus says the Lord. And if we don't do that or take that upon ourselves to stand up and say that, we are the ones that's not carrying on what we are supposed to do. But if you, again, the Pharisees, I go back to the Pharisees and what they did and didn't do, because all they were looking for an accusation, because this man is coming in, the people are following him, they're not following me. It's all about pride, it's all about I'm the leader, they're supposed to be listening to me. So when they walked out, now the crowd has no clue. Okay, since they walked out, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah. So and that's a good point. The Pharisees knew what they were doing. Jesus knew what they were doing. But the crowd really was just a pawn in the Pharisees' game that they were trying to manipulate for their trap for Jesus, right? And they didn't know that. But that, like you said, that doesn't really place them in a position where they can't stand up and do what's right, right? But as we see here, they just keep their mouth shut. I don't want to challenge you. Did you? Oh.
What were they doing? They stood up and know what was right. What was right in that situation?
That's a good question. That's a good question. Because I think that's part of the struggle of the story. What is what's right in this story? Because you could make a really good argument that since the law said what it said, that the Pharisees were the ones who were right. But I'm going to say let's pause, because we're going to get to the end of the story and we're going to see a different ending than what the Pharisees wanted to see, I think.
If the Pharisees were right, they would have done so properly and not, understood the heart of the law, understood the mercy that Jesus is bringing. Because, mercy was there from the beginning. God really desired mercy. It does that in the Old Testament, how many times? A number of times. And they turned this in, which is human nature. We turn these things into our own, like Gary was saying today, I don't like the way that, I like it this way. I'm gonna believe this way. Not quite what God said. And that's what they did. That's why the Pharisees were in the cultural situation they were.
All right.
I would have had to stood up for the woman and said, what, the charge, what we know, what she did was wrong.
Yeah.
So you could hardly stand up for the woman.
Yeah.
In this case, that, because we know she was guilty, but.
I think from our vision today, we can see that a lot clearly, hindsight.
Yeah. So I'm gonna move on. So the next party that I've got on my list is the woman, okay, in this story that I wanna look at because you bring up some good points. Is the woman guilty? Yes. Okay, there's one thing that's not in doubt in this story whatsoever. The woman is guilty. The woman has sinned. Okay, so there's no denying the sin in this story. There's no denying what she did. Okay, she's caught red-handed. So there's no way to get around this. Sin was committed. Okay, there's no doubt about that, right? So now I want to step back for a moment and say, how are we like the woman in the story?
Because we are guilty.
We
All
are
that
guilty.
sin comes short of the word of God.
Okay.
We are the woman. We've all done whatever sin that we've done. We're like her. And, I think the trap was, Jesus could say he was teaching the crowds. What was he teaching them? He was teaching them love and forgiveness. He was also indicating he was the Son of God. I think the trap is the Pharisees knew what Jesus was teaching, and they said, well, okay, if he's from God, then he's going to have to say, stone her. But that's contrary to what that he's been teaching. So we're going to get him in this trap. We're going to catch him. Because there's only two answers, right? Either kill her or don't kill her, forgive her. And they're like, okay, well, if he's from God, then he's got to say, stone her. But he didn't take either approach. He said, okay, whoever's without sin, you throw the first stone. And the crowd knew that the Pharisees were just as guilty as everybody else. So he kind of turned it on them. Jesus didn't take the one or the other. He said, if you think she's guilty, go for it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to see here, and like you said, we're going to see that when Jesus kind of turns the tables on everybody, is the woman is us, in essence, because we're sinful, we're guilty, we've done it, right? And according to the law, we deserve death. Okay? So in this story, we very well represent the woman because we've come before Jesus, we've been brought before Jesus, and we've been caught red-handed, and we're the sinners, and we deserve death. And now we're standing before Jesus, and everybody's looking at us and saying, well, the law says stone them. And so, hopefully when we read this story, we have a heart for the woman because we can see that in our own lives and say, you know what, that's me. So what do I deserve? And then, of course, the fourth party in the story is Jesus, right? We have Jesus here. And one of the things I want to say is, of everybody in this situation, Jesus is the one who was wronged. Jesus is God, right? Jesus is the Son of God. He is God. The law was broken. Who was wronged?
Wronged.
Yeah, wronged.
Okay.
Okay.
I thought you said he was wrong.
No. Jesus was wronged, meaning he was the one who was offended, okay? Because Jesus represents God here, and sin was committed. The person who was, I'll use the word offended instead of wrong. The person who was offended here was Jesus.
Actually, I think he was the person who had the right to be offended,
Correct.
but I don't know that he really was.
Well, yeah, I guess there's a couple ways to look at it.
Go back to wrong.
But, yeah. But see, the law was broken. She committed sin. Jesus is the one who has been wronged in this situation. Not the Pharisees, not the crowd, but Jesus is the one who's been wronged. So the woman did the deed. She was brought before Jesus. Jesus is God in this, Jesus is God, the Son of God. So the law was broken. The offense was committed. So now let's step back. How are we like Jesus in this story?
You're going to stretch a little bit for that answer.
Well, has anybody ever wronged you?
Me, Shane.
Has everybody sinned against you? Yeah.
Just real quick, I saw this recently, and I think it relates to your lesson here. They had a member from the Emmanuel AME Church, if you may remember that. There was a church in North Carolina where a gunman went and killed like 9 people. I think it was a Wednesday night Bible class or something. Anyway, they had him on there because I think his wife was one of the people who were killed. He was talking about the issue of the message of forgiveness on TV. He was saying that, but what do you mean? You think you shouldn't be in jail? Should be in an office? No, I think I'm willing to go. I want to see this man go to heaven. I want to see him repent and go to heaven. So I think they did talk about the example, Jesus' example. I think he was certainly trying to follow Christ.
Yeah. But how many times when we're the one who's wronged, is that not our reaction, right? See, when the sin is committed against us and it's brought in front of us, how often do we choose forgiveness over punishment? See, there are instances where, like Jesus in this story, someone has done us wrong. They've hurt us. They've sinned against us. They've lied to us. They've stole from us. They've done something to us. It happens to all of us. And now it's brought before us, and now we have the choice of forgiveness or not, right? How many times do you hear people say, "I'll never forgive you for that"? Do we want revenge or do we want forgiveness?
Our brain probably wants, I don't know, one of those wants the revenge. And again, it goes back to this. These are some very basic fleshly desires. These are no different than all the other fleshly desires in my mind.
Yeah.
You have to fight against them. And that's the battle.
Yeah.
My wife had a comment.
She obviously wanted to say it.
So, I think that one of the things, this isn't really an answer to what you're exactly asking now, but as far as talking about Jesus, is that it's really interesting to me. Today I was thinking, why is this what the Pharisees chose as the trap? Like, they could have chosen anything, but they chose this. Maybe that is why they brought the woman. Maybe they did know he doesn't just automatically treat women like dirt or whatever. And then if you think about it, I mean, it really is the whole essence. He came to fulfill the law, not to abolish it. He said that. I'm not saying the Pharisees knew that yet, but I think the fact that this is what they chose.
Yeah.
To trip him up, and then also that, I also love that, I'm just going to say this because, that he didn't answer right away. Like a lot of times Jesus would do that. It said they kept questioning him, so that doesn't record here what they said, but I can picture them harassed, on, and then, so then he finally, he answered. But even that, he wasn't even gonna answer them at first, he wasn't gonna just, and I don't know what all that says about him, but he did that a lot, and I like that too, not that he didn't just quick to answer one way or the other.
Maybe something we can learn from.
Yeah, and I also think that the crowd, like you said earlier this morning, we were talking, that they were not a 21st century American crowd. I mean, this was in the temple. It's possible that no one would have really stood up in the temple because only the authorities or rabbis could do that or stop and interrupt. I don't know. I'm giving the crowd. I'm thinking they're like a group, they were there because they were listening to him. It said they gathered around Jesus and they were listening to him. So I kind of think there was somebody, all different types there. Some that wanted to see a stoning, some that wanted whatever.
All right. I got Jim, go ahead, Jim.
I find it interesting that why do they fear him so? What was their motivation for doing this? I mean, were they that in fear of what he was doing?
I think the answer is yes. I think they heard his message, they saw his followers, and they were afraid.
I've got a different thought concerning the Pharisees. A lot of times when we talk about Pharisees, we say, well, they're hypocritical, they don't have the proper heart. And you go over to Matthew chapter 23, and there's at least 7 times the Lord says, woe unto you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. So there is that aspect of the Pharisees. But I think one thing that we think of a Pharisee as someone that is judgmental, someone that is legalistic, because they were sticklers and followers of the law. And to my knowledge, the Lord never condemns them for being sticklers for the law or following the law. And to me, what the Lord condemns is their heart and their hypocrisy. And a lot of times I think we today want to throw the Pharisees into the boat of, hey, don't be a stickler of the law like the Pharisees, or don't be legalistic like the Pharisees. But in reality, the Lord never condemned them for those aspects, but he did condemn their hypocrisy and their heart.
Yeah. And I'd say the one time Jesus almost says something nice about them is about their knowledge of the law. But like you said, his criticism of them was where their heart was.
Matthew 23 is just a scathing
Yeah.
rebuke of the Pharisees
All right.
for their heart.
So real quickly, I want to read the rest of this, and then I'm just going to throw the rest of these notes away and we'll be done. But so I just wanted to
my world.
Yeah. But Jesus bent down and started around the ground with his finger, and when they kept on questioning, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without a sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground, and at this those who heard began to go away, one at a time, the older ones at first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." I just want to end on this one thing, and then we'll quit. But one, Jesus is the one that is wronged here. Sin was committed, and I want us to notice 2 things. Jesus was the right judge, but he doesn't condone the sin. But Jesus chooses to forgive instead. Okay? So Jesus doesn't condone the sin, because he tells her, "Go and leave your life of sin." It's not okay with Jesus that sin was committed. However, Jesus chooses to forgive instead of stone. He had the right to stone her. In my opinion, he had the right to stone her, if anybody did. But he doesn't. He forgives. And so I think for us that big takeaway, a big takeaway is Jesus forgives us. And as a result, Jesus expects us to forgive others. And so when we look at this story, we see a story about a Jesus who's willing to forgive in the light of being wronged. And then he's asking us to do the same thing. I've got a bunch of other verses, but I'm not going to read them. I'm just going to stop there. And that's what I want the big takeaway to be is Jesus forgave us first when he didn't have to. And now he calls us to do the same thing and forgive others when we're wrong. Is your hand up, John? I don't have a device on.
We've been talking about adultery, and this is an opportunity for me to make an unadulterated plug for our Wednesday night class. Christ here in this context was an example of critical thinking, which is exactly what Rob is honing in on. For those of you who are not there on Wednesday night, you're missing out on a real treasure. He's teaching us how to think critically about what Jesus says. And it's different from the snap judgments that the Pharisees made, or that some in the crowd were ready to make when they were trying to learn more about Jesus. There may have been some followers, there may have been some who sided more with the Pharisees. But Jesus challenged them to not make a snap judgment, to think critically about what they were talking. That's exactly what Rob's doing, and y'all need to be there on Wednesday night.
I guess.
Second that.
All right. So, are you raising your hand?
I'm raising my hand.
Okay.
But it's just a little small incident.
Okay.
Why did the elders, when he says convicted of their own conscience, when they heard it, they went out one by one, beginning at the eldest?
Okay, you're going to like my interpretation of this.
Okay.
It's because when we get older, we gather wisdom to understand the sins that we've committed and the forgiveness that God offers. And so we recognize that before the younger people who don't have that wisdom.
I'll cite Gary's sermon. I'll cite Gary's sermon today. When you're 16 years old, you know everything.
All right, we're stopping.
Thank you.